opportunity. Let me apologize. I don't know if you can hear. I'm living in a flat at the moment, and somebody is drilling on the floor above. So if you hear an incessant drill, apologies. There isn't anything that I can do about it, alas. Okay, so I thought that I would talk to this paper, hopefully briefly. I know it was a bit of a brick that I sent you, and I'm not assuming that many people have managed to plow their way through it. So I'm going to try and just give an outline of what the paper is about, but starting by setting it in the context of the wider project of which it is part. So for many years now, too long actually, I've been working on a project which has kind of gotten a title, and it's called Racial Material: The Politics of Race and Consumption in South Africa, circa 1870 to 1970. And it started out with an interest that I had in histories of consumption in South Africa. Many of you will know that, you know, in many other parts of the world, the literature on the history of consumption has been burgeoning for quite some time, but it's taken a lot longer for that kind of spark to ignite in Southern Africa, for reasons which are probably quite interesting in and of themselves. I think that is starting to change, but I've been interested in that gap and in trying to work in any number of fascinating aspects of that history. But given what I've previously been working on and writing about, which sort of, you know, in the aggregate has been around issues of race making and statecraft, it's that linkage that I've been interested in. How has the history, what light does the history or histories of consumption or aspects thereof in South Africa, what light does that shed on questions of racial governance and the history of racial governance? You'll have to do your muting, Stephen. Okay. You know, and a few years ago, I was writing one of those sort of god-awful big things you have to write sometimes. I wrote this chapter for the Cambridge History of South Africa on the Apartheid Project, which was a kind of attempt to synthesize, you know, the field at the time. And when I look back on that, I realized that I'm, you know, that like many people who have written about racial governance, that question of its linkages to histories of consumption has been completely absent. So it's a terrain, you know, in a not much written history of consumerism and consumption in South Africa. I think that issue in particular merits a lot more analysis and a lot more interest. The Canadian legal scholar Alan Hunt wrote a magisterial book on the history of sumptuary laws, which he called The Governance of Consuming Passions, which is such a wonderful title. And after having read that, you know, it posed the question for me in a particularly acute way. In the absence of sumptuary laws, which are a very obvious repertoire of a regulatory apparatus applied to the consuming passions, how in the absence of sumptuary laws and in the midst of a burgeoning capitalist economy, which goes hand in hand with a white supremacist project, how do you govern the consuming passions? Because in a modernizing economy, consumption, consumerism as a project is one of seduction, temptation, persuasion. So how does that sit alongside efforts to produce quite labyrinthine systems of coercive racial regulation? So what is the articulation between strategies of temptation and coercion? I started this work looking at the post-World War II period, which in global histories of consumption is a kind of watershed period. But what I found is that the more work I did, the more I wanted to push back. It seemed like I couldn't understand the 50s without going back to the 40s, 30s, and 20s. And then I kept wanting to go back again. So I've ended up in a period about which I really know dangerously little, I suspect. It certainly hasn't been my stomping ground for much of my career. So I became really interested in the 19th century, have tried to immerse myself to the extent that it has been possible. But I think I have finally found a beginning for this work, or at least a place to start. And that is with what I'm calling the consumer revolution of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Okay, so let me talk then a little bit about what this paper on the consumer revolution is about. My primary purpose in the paper is to make the case for its existence or its occurrence. But I suppose anticipating the so what question, I also wanted to at least indicate some of the symbolic and ideological currency that the consumer revolution elicited and how these produced racial investments too. Okay, so it's a long paper, and again, apologies for that. And it is, as if you've read it, you will see it's a sort of big picture paper, a big picture argument. It's an attempt to argue for what I've called a sea change in the conditions of material consumption, pretty much across the board in South Africa. It's a paper that tries to piece together a series of what look to me like unprecedented changes across different facets of commercial life and practices of consumption in particular. So it sort of has the difficulties and dissatisfaction of a sort of big picture paper, because I can't go into detail about anything. So, you know, there's much more that can be said about every single paragraph in the paper. And even as a big picture, it's probably only a big-ish picture, because there are several gaps. It's certainly not comprehensive. So the question that I, would like to pose to you as readers and listeners is, in the first instance, are you persuaded? Or do I have to do more to convince you about such a thing? Okay. And as I indicate in the paper, I know that the term consumer revolution is one that some people don't like, but I've tried to make a case for it as much rhetorically as analytically, because rhetorically, I think what it does do is underline a sense of a rupture. It draws attention to something that I think has previously not been the focus of very much attention. So I suppose it's a particular kind of optic. It's a particular kind of rhetorical device. But again, tell me if you're persuaded. One of the sections that I omitted, that I deleted from a longer version of this paper, was on my sources and the historiographical kind of background to the paper. So let me just quickly fill that in briefly. So most of the primary material that I've used in this paper comes from newspapers, from magazines, some archival papers, although, the frustration of access to archives under lockdown you all know about, and lots of travelers' accounts. That year that I had in London, I immersed myself in that miracle, the British Library, and I read all the travelers' accounts to South Africa during this period that I could find, which I found fascinating. So you can tell probably from just even that brief mention of my primary material that there is a particular optic that emerges from this material, from this archive. It is primarily a kind of view from above rather than a view from below, but I am interested in the question of power, in the question of how a series of events started to look from above. In terms of secondary material, you'll see that I've drawn quite on many sources, some of them the work of economic historians, which I've found useful, and also those historians who have written about consumption in this time, which includes Tim, and I'm delighted that you're here, Tim, and thank you for your path-breaking book. But most of the people who have written in that vein, histories of consumption, I think have primarily been interested in the history of consumption among African peoples. And partly this has emanated from an interest in the missions and the ways in which missionaries proselytized around commodities. There's very much less in that literature about the top end, much less on affluent consumption, and it was mostly affluent white consumption, and almost nothing about that at its very apex, which is the sort of emergent white nouveau riche of that time. And I must say, when I was working towards this paper, I was fascinated by that white nouveau riche, and I'm amazed that so little has been written about it, actually, because I think they're enormously significant politically and had a huge impact, it seems to me, on imaginaries of colonial whiteness. And that just, let me just allude on that, on that score to what I think is another gap in the literature. And that is in relation to the history of colonial whiteness in this time. So there is a literature that looks at whiteness in relation to the history of ideas. So I'm thinking here, for example, about Saul's work, A Commonwealth of Knowledge, History of Social Darwinism. There is a lot less, and tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm missing something. I mean, I am very aware of Vivian Bigbit-Smith's work, so he's writing about this in relation to Cape Town. But in general, a lot less on the material practices, the everyday lifestyles of whiteness, which seem to me as formative, perhaps even more so, in trying to understand the sort of zeitgeist of colonial whiteness than just the history of ideas. What I would want to argue, and I haven't been able to do so within the limits of this paper, but I do think that what we see emerging by the turn of the century is what I would call a new public sphere of consumption. But okay, I'm getting ahead of myself there. Let's get back to the paper and the question of the consumer revolution. One more historiographical remark. I mean, we all know that the literature on the mining revolution is substantial. But I think it's true to say that the overwhelming emphasis in that literature is on the sphere of production, on the mining industries themselves, on questions of labor, how to recruit labor, how to regulate labor, class struggle, and how all of that impacted on the emerging state. There has been a lot less, not nothing, but a lot less on how all of that affected commercial life and the consumption of commodities in particular. So this paper kind of is inserted into that gap. And when I started reading around it, I have to say, I did not go in search of a consumer revolution, not in the least. The kind of turn to that concept emerged as part of an effort to try and name what emerged as a pattern in what I was finding. Because it looked to me, after a fair amount of reading, that in respect of a number of different facets of commercial life and the life of consumers, that surprisingly, I kept hitting upon what seemed to be unprecedented orders of change. And also, by the way, a sort of language of surprise and a language of hyperbole amongst those who were commenting on the same at the time. So everything I was reading pointed to a sense of a rupture or a sea change in several dimensions. Firstly, in relation to South Africa's global connectedness and the technologies that enabled that. Shipping, railways, telegraphs, the postal system, etc. And how that affected circuits of trade and velocities of travel. Secondly, in relation to the sort of vitality and vigor of commerce and the scale of trade within the country. And thirdly, just in relation to the amounts and varieties of stuff that had permeated people's lives and across a much wider range of consumers than had been the case prior to this. So what I've tried to do in the paper is to organize that sense of how unprecedented change across a variety of fronts came together by dividing it up in 4 categories. But hopefully on the understanding as you read it that they are always interlinked, and I'm interested in the aggregate effect. So firstly, in respect of consumer demand and the proliferation of new categories of consumers. And as I argue in the paper, that's partly as a consequence of immigration. And in the paper, I don't go into very much detail on categories other than Jews and Asians, because they kind of, I pick them up in the next category in relation to trading. So, for example, one of the gaps in the paper is I don't have a discussion in there on Chinese immigrants, and I don't know very much about the ways in which they consumed and who met their consumer demands. So that's certainly a gap. But I suppose the category that is, to me, so that jumped out at me so dramatically when I was thinking about this was the emergence of new groups of Africans who became consumers by participating in the cash economy of the mines. Because every African worker on the mines was also a consumer. And then, of course, there were ripple effects of the advent of mining within consuming circles in the rural hinterlands of African life. It's also a period during which, as written about by Colin Bundy and others, period during which an African peasantry became increasingly prosperous, and another growing category of consumers. And various people like Karen Brown have written interestingly about how during this period the authority of chiefs over consumption was waning, which was opening up new spaces along gender and generational lines for new patterns of consumption, new categories of African consumers. The second of the 4 categories I look at is the proliferation of trade and what I'm calling new geographies of trade in this area, which I found striking. In the paper, in the small section of the paper, I primarily look at the impact of Jewish and Asian trade, particularly among the Asians who went into trade. Okay, those were mainly the passenger Indians. And among Jews, one of the striking facets of Jewish immigration to South Africa was very low rates of proletarianization. Almost all Jewish immigrants went into trade in one or other form. So in that section, I'm trying to point to the fact that very few corners of the country were left untouched by the end of this period. One of the travelers' accounts that I read in the British Library was by an erstwhile magistrate in the Eastern Cape called Scully, W.M. Scully. And by the way, Stephen, that is South Africa's equivalent of Thorstein Veblen. Yo, he writes with enormous spleen in his observations about the Nouveau Riche in Johannesburg. But anyway, in one of his chapters, he writes about the stigma that attached to the life of a white trader, particularly in a sort of less salubrious area of the country. I don't know how representative that is, but it's certainly the case that for immigrants whose lives were very precarious certainly in the beginning, there were no such scruples and no such stigma attached, and people were willing to go anywhere and everywhere. I think one of the other things I don't emphasize enough in the paper is the other facet of the changing geography of trade, which is international and transnational. And again, it's primarily Jewish and Asian entrepreneurs who were vectors of those kinds of connections. I think that there's some of that has been written up in the history of Asian trading. In the history of Jewish trading, which is scant actually in this period, not nearly enough has been written about those linkages, borrowing one really very, very good book by Sarah Stein on the ostrich, on the trade in the global trade in ostrich feathers. Then the third section is about commodities themselves and the sort of enormous proliferation thereof in the world in the late 19th century, which I think is just fascinating in and of itself. I can't tell you how much time I have spent reading about the history of things, of chocolate and champagne and guns and cigarettes and flushing toilets and all manner of things which suddenly became available in vast numbers in that time and took to the seas. Included in that, I mean, by the way, and I know many of you know this, were a kind of new proliferating range of pills and pharmaceuticals and cosmetics. And I know that in your department, Timbisa, I know you are one among others who are doing work on a history of the consumption of pharmaceuticals. And I hope it's one of the things we might be able to talk about, because I'm sure that in and of itself sheds an interesting light on some of these sort of broader brushstrokes that I'm trying to paint here. So I became interested simply in the fact of material proliferation, but of course it's never just the thing in itself that's interesting. The things are usually dripping with meaning. So that, it becomes interesting what else travels with the material thing as it makes its way around the globe. And in that respect, I got very absorbed by the history of industrial exhibitions, starting with the Great Exhibition in Crystal Palace in London in 1851, about which a lot has been written because, this was certainly culturally, politically, economically, a massively important institution in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. And remarkably, nothing has been written about industrial exhibitions in South Africa. Jenny Robinson wrote one article about the exhibition in Johannesburg in 1936, I think it was. But these were these industrial exhibitions were sort of slightly different animal. They were very much about the material optics of empire and the colonies, the global world of the colonies in this time. And as I say in the paper, they were absolutely about saturating the proliferation of things with meanings very much associated with civilization understood as a material accomplishment. I wrote very little in the paper about exhibitions. I wasn't really able to, so very, very happy to talk more about that. And then the last section of the paper is about new types of shops and shopping, which I know is, for some reason, something that many people still think is a sort of trivial kind of topic, but I don't. I think it's quite fascinating. And there's lots of gaps in the existing literature and in the research that I was able to do. For example, I'm still looking for more material on mine concession stores. And if anybody has any to direct my attention to, I'd be very grateful. I know Ruth Hall wrote a paper on mine concession stores on the coal mines in Natal and the use of tokens. And I haven't read, apart from a few things that Charles van Onselen has said, I haven't read very much about the gold mines, so I'd like to know more about that. Most of that section is really about department stores, the advent of department stores in South Africa in the late 19th century, which again is not a topic that's previously excited any interest in South Africa at that time. Bridget Kenny has written about them, but her primary interest is in the questions of labor, but also of a later period. But it's the late 19th century that's really the kind of launch of this phenomenon, and it's a launch which is hugely symbolically invested. So there's a lot more going on than simply a new type of shopping. It's all about the spectacle of the commodity, an aestheticization of commerce, and elevating the experience of the department store and what it represents to those who are who indulge in the experience with the kind of garb of civilization. And then just briefly, the paper ends by pulling out two key points of articulation between changing consumption patterns and the regulation of race. And in both cases, the crucible, the sort of the node around which those things connect, is the notion of civilization as a material accomplishment. So the first of these is this sort of at the top end of the consuming hierarchy, this largely white elite at its apex. And what I identify there is what I call a zeitgeist of material abundance, which I think is new in the country at that time, with echoes of a similar kind of zeitgeist in other parts of the world, in America, under the rubric of the Gilded Age, and in parts of Europe. London too, very much in the grip of the phenomenon of a nouveau riche. And what the paper shows is how that zeitgeist infused claims to national prowess, global visibility, and stature. To be worldly at that time, to take your place on a global stage, was certainly included being able to strut your stuff along with others. I also suggest how this zeitgeist of material abundance became insinuated into the expectations of whiteness and a new sense of aspiration to abundance.
Debbie, shall we leave it there?
One more point. Can I just make one point?
Yeah.
Okay. So just looking ahead into the 20th century, one of the things I'm interested in is how that zeitgeist gathered steam and how a sense of white material entitlement would seep into the middle and the lower classes. And then lastly, the second point of articulation is what I call in the paper the potential subversiveness of African consumerist desire. And in the paper, it's located in the rudiments of a paradox that would deepen into a contradiction. And that is the relationship between, around the African consumer, say. So I show in the paper that cultivating African consumption was a commercial no-brainer. But politically and ideologically, this was a far more complicated matter, as people like Tim actually have pointed out in their work. Because if civilization was a material accomplishment, then surely smart Black consumers could emulate it, which would not sit very comfortably with the ideological logic of a white supremacist project. And so another thing to look ahead to in the 20th century is episodes of argument and conflict over exactly that. Okay. And I want to just make one very, very final comment, because it is also partly a question to everybody who is listening. And that is about another thing that is a potential gap in the paper. And I just simply do not know enough at this stage to know if it is, how sufficient of a gap it is. I haven't said anything in the paper about the growth of trading among Africans themselves. The extent to which there was or wasn't a substantial growth in entrepreneurship, let's say, or a will to entrepreneurship within African communities. I know about individuals like Peregrino, for example, the likes of him who tried to start up a movement to promote business or commerce among Africans. But if anybody has anything to tell me about that, I'd be very grateful. All right, thank you, Stephen, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Debbie. All right, so we're looking for questions. You can raise your hand by pressing the reactions button and pressing raise hand, or you can, of course, ask a question in the chat. Let's go first off with Nafisa.
Thank you, Debbie. I will not go on about how interesting the paper is, because obviously it's interesting. So I'm going to move straight on to some of the questions that, in response to some of the questions that you asked. And, you know, the thing is, when the thing about all the books that have come out about, you know, consumer revolutions, consumerism, they all claim to be part of a kind of shift to cultural history. And there's something about this book that still reads in a very materialist vein. I mean, you say that the minds are about production and not enough about consumption. And when you talk about symbolism and ideology, I fear that there isn't enough really in the paper. I mean, there's a lot about the expansion of consumer goods markets and trading, and the fact of consumption or consumerism or whatever. It's very little about the kind of historically contingent nature or characteristic features of the consumption that we're talking about. I mean, the commodity, Tim's book shows, if anything, that the commodities and the desires do not always map on in quite the ways that that we think. And if the consumer revolution is really about the manufacturing of desire, then we need to know more about its subjects and much more about, I think, the desires of its subjects. And, you know, I think when you say that, and you use the word articulation, which I thought was quite lovely, between consumption or racial consumption and consumption and racial regulation, and you say that that articulation is at the node of civilization. I think the idea of civilization is rather, it's not fleshed out. It's very thin. I don't really know what you mean by that in the paper. I mean, it's supposed to signify a lot of things, and I'm not sure what those are. And I mean, it reminded me first and foremost of Lynn Thomas's Beauty and Respectability piece in the Journal of African History about the modern girl, and also her subsequent work about the modern girl, about class anxieties amongst urban Africans and gender and sexuality. And then reminding me about your own work that demonstrates more or less that racial regulation and gender relations are kind of inextricable. You know, marriage at the drop of a hat, etc. Right? And so, of course, my question in the end is about gender. If, you know, the history of consumerism is also sort of loaded freight, is that it's a history of feminine excess. The household is the site of consumption. And, you know, and that this kind of plays into that, I think, a little bit. And I'm wondering how we can, how you might want to expand that. What's missing definitely here, and I think what makes it so materially heavy, is that there isn't talk of other things that go with this revolution, for example, like leisure or youth. And I think those are really quite important features of this. I mean, you know, of course I could go on, but I do think that gender and race have to work together in a very important way when it comes to consumerism and consumption. And given the nature of migrancy and the gendered relationships in the production and disposal of wages, and the waves of gendered migration, we really do need to, you know, once again, listen to Belinda Bozzoli about gender and the articulation of the modes of production. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nafisa. Before Debbie replies, just to point out, there are some interesting comments already coming into the chat that I think you'll find useful, Debbie. But respond to Nafisa, and then we'll move on to Tim and others. Sorry, Debbie, I muted you by accident. Can you unmute yourself?
Thanks.
There we go.
Apologies that I am bad at reading. I find that when I'm listening, I'm not reading the chat column at the same time. I'm not multitasking here, so I will read the comments. Nafisa, thank you for the question. And I mean, it kind of gets to the heart of the challenge that I had in writing this paper. So, of course, there are a whole bunch of things that I haven't written about. And it was a case of, it comes back to how I'm using the term consumer revolution and what is a marker, a defining marker of that revolution as compared with one of its effects. Okay. I did say in that kind of blockbuster footnote that people use the term in different ways. I have not used the term a consumer revolution to be defined by a manufacturing of desire, because I find that is a very difficult thing to get a handle of. And a lot of the literature that writes about the manufacturing of desire actually writes about techniques intended to manufacture desire, and it's much less effusive about, you know, how much of that desire was actually produced, because I think there always is a tendency, perhaps it comes out of a kind of Foucauldian lineage, you know, to conflate a technique of power with its effects. So I don't want to prejudge in this paper what the effects of the consumer revolution are, but I do want to be able to say that a series of things changed, and I have probably deliberately used what you're calling a materially heavy definition of what that is. So I am trying to say that a series of things changed in relation to how people did business, and that a lot flowed from that. Initially, when I was thinking of writing the paper, I was going to confine myself to what you've called the materially heavy. But as I said in the introduction, I knew that then people would say to me, well, so what? And so I had to some extent, anticipate why this is an interesting thing to be writing about. And that's why the paper alludes to the sort of ideological and symbolic facets of it. And in no way do I flesh any of this out substantially. So the question gets to me, to the heart of whether I have solved a kind of a challenge in producing the paper. Is it a viable paper? Is it viable to be able to write about these material changes, largely in and of themselves? Are they interesting enough in and of themselves? Okay, so that's part of an answer. I absolutely take your point about civilization, because that is a very important part of this, the sort of thin argument about ideology and symbolism that I'm making. I do need to go into that in a bit more detail. But the things about leisure and youth and a lot of that, I'm regarding as effects of the consumer revolution rather than markers thereof. Okay. And as I say, people have used this term in a variety of different ways. Some people have used it, much like me, in a materially heavy way. Others have spoken about it in the realm of desire as a kind of, you know, as though they're writing a cultural history, which is not what I've been writing about. On the question of gender, yeah, so the longer draft of this paper did have much more about ways in which gender and generation, those relationships were being unsettled. But in the main, but I ended up sort of, when I cut it down, I ended up just alluding to most of what I was talking about in the paper is really about the consumption by men, with ramifications for women. But it seems to me that the dramatic changes in respect of consumption at this time have been in respect of the consumption by men. You may disagree with that. You know, the section on the department store obviously alludes to the kinds of changes that sphere opened up in respect of women. But yeah, it's one of the many scantnesses in the paper. So I suppose I want to come back to you, Nafiso. Tell me, do you think, if you were to read a paper that was only about, or largely about, the material heaviness of this, would it be interesting enough to you?
Well, I think quite brutally, no. And the reason I say that is because, you know, I would think about things. I mean, South Africa has such a rich social history, and you know, it makes me think of white wedding dresses and white weddings. Natasha's here, so, you know, she can tell you more about that. But it makes me think that in some ways there are, you know, a burgeoning of certain kinds of commodities that you simply cannot get by without explaining in more sort of in culturally deeper ways that are connected to other things. But we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to stop talking, but we should definitely talk off Zoom about this.
Yeah, let's have the conversation. Let's let the conversation continue. Timothy Burke.
So I'm just really delighted that you're writing about this, and and I have, as you might expect, too much to say, and I want to apologize in advance that I'm going to have to drop out shortly to attend a committee meeting. There's the problem with Zoom, right?
Lucky you. Yeah.
Yeah, but I did have, one or two really small suggestions just to start. Is I do think there's a lovely history of Jewish trading in Zimbabwe by Barry Cosman called Majuta. That's really useful, I think, for the specific context that you're interested in, even though it's not in South Africa. The other thing that kind of occurs to me is that I found reading material by the Bureau of Market Research at UNISA from the 60s really useful, just because if nothing else, it often had they were often doing research on household budgets and kind of household materiality in townships. But it's also shot through with the anxiety about African consumption that you referenced. The thing,
right?
yeah,
that's a later period. That's the 1960s.
Yeah, it's later. But some of it speaks backwards in interesting ways. I think the thing that I haven't seen anybody, and I this is such an august company of folks, somebody may be able to tell me that I'm missing something. But I think the strategy that's been used in a lot of other national historiographies of consumption hasn't been used in South Africa as much as looking at wills, probate, bankruptcies. Things that produce inventories of materiality, of consumer materiality. And that might specifically be really useful for that kind of nouveau riche, white affluence, and turn up stuff that doesn't necessarily appear in those witnessings that are also very rich from travelers and from people talking about these sort of new material scenes that they're observing. I think the one, the two moments that seem to me to be very interesting for getting at the question of what you and Nafisa were just talking about are, on one hand, looking at the discourse about poor whiteism in between, say, 1913 and 1948, because that frequently references a sort of notion that poor whiteism is materially visible, and that its solution is to find ways to get resources, financial resources, but more importantly, material goods into households that need to signify whiteness. And so I think that's one place where you can suddenly these sorts of notions about civilization, race, power, and materiality become very visible. The other is, I think, kind of in that quote from Harry's that you mentioned, and when you're thinking about kind of African consumption, that's really important, is that he picks up on a lot of these miners are bringing home goods in order to sell them to others. In other words, they're moving from a site of acquisition to a site where the possession of those goods puts them in a position to short circuit certain kinds of gerontocracies around cattle and so on. They've now got goods that they can maybe sell for cash, but more importantly, can construct their own networks of reciprocity and dependence off of. And the goal is to bring home as much as possible. It's not for them mostly. And you see hints of that even if you look at, say, the budgets in the back of Ruyard. It picks up on the things that people have. And at first the thought is some people in the slum have things that seem extravagant, but if you read between the lines in the way that detailed information lets you do, for example, there's one woman who has a gramophone, and the commentary is something like, this seems very extravagant, but when you think about it, it's very likely, it seems to me, a person who's also doing sex work, where the gramophone is part of the material world she's summoning up around for her clients. And so I think to look at that transition from how do you get from, consumer materiality that is about communicating status, but is also about very practical strategies of accumulation, to something that is about some sense of a subjectivity that desires. I think that question of a subjectivity that desires is really important. But I think there are moments where we can kind of see the question of why are people getting things, and what are they communicating with them about class, about status, about accumulation. And that goes as much for the white nouveau riche as anybody else. They're trying to say something. It may not be about stuff they actually want, somewhere in here. Not that we can often see that, but there are other messages about class and power and hierarchy that need to be communicated materially in particular ways. And so I think that's the way you work what Nafisa was sort of pointing to, is via that question. And I think it's a really empirical thing that you can talk about.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Before you reply, Debbie, can we just read Temisa's question in the chat? My question is, Debbie, you write at the end that consumption was almost, emphasis on almost, a free space for Black consumers in contrast to other forms of difference and repression. You note in passing the exception of alcohol. My question is about that exception and about regulation of what Johann Matthew calls dubious commodities. More generally, there are other commodities that are prohibited for sale and purchase not only for Black people but for everyone. These exceptions to the free market help define what is permitted in markets, but also as markers of civilizational aspiration. Can you say, oopsie, one sec. Can you say more about regulation more generally as an aspect rising with the consumer revolution? All right, so those two questions for you.
Thank you. Okay, starting with Tim. Yeah, I mean, your point, your apropos Patrick Harries and buying goods to sell them on or to craft various other networks of reciprocity. That's a very nice point, and thanks for that. And I think that's a useful way of thinking through the kind of nexus of materiality and sociality. I mean, I don't think that gets to the question of the extent to which the very definition of a consumer revolution has to anticipate its full ideological and symbolic weight. And I think that was, for me, the issue that was coming up most sort of directly in Nafisa's question. But in relation to what you're saying about poor whiteism, I absolutely agree. And in fact, I have a chapter on the poor white question, which grows absolutely out of what I'm trying to argue in this chapter. And then once again, it's a global current about the idea of civilized labor. I mean, it's partly coming out of the, is it the Lake and Reynolds book about sort of white labor as a kind of global phenomenon and the kind of ideological resources that are being drawn upon globally. And then I think there's a very interesting book, I think by Lawrence Glickman, I think it's called A Living Wage, where he's also looking at the genealogy of the idea of a standard of living, which is also globally current at this time. And how, for me, what needs to be factored into writings on the poor white question is how that set of ideas about the entitlements of whiteness, the idea of a civilized standard of living, gets incorporated into the South African debates about white poverty. So yes, I mean, I absolutely agree. There's a kind of a direct line from this to the question of poor whiteism. And then Timbisa's question. I mean, that's, it's a huge question, and it's difficult for me to answer it right now. I mean, I think that I do know that there were some sort of undesirable things, things that you're not supposed to have, that were not very effectively regulated. I'm thinking, for example, about pornography. And then would be a fascinating PhD for somebody, is the history of pornography at this time, because this is the point in the world in which a kind of mass proliferation of erotica takes place, and it gets sort of all sent around the world, and including to South Africa, and including into black markets. It was one of those little slivers also that I took out when I shortened the paper. But it was the case that the African market here was in receipt of a series of various pieces of erotica that were intended for Black consumption. So, okay, but that doesn't speak to your question more generally. I mean, I'm sure that there were a whole number of goods that nobody was supposed to consume, whether they consumed them or not, how porous the regulatory apparatus was in general. I probably just don't know enough to be able to answer that question more fully.
Thanks, Debbie. Before I have Mark, Natasha, and Mareka, but quickly, let me just read one of our postgraduate students, Amanda Mangana's question, which, well, let me just quickly try and gloss it reliably, which is that she really asks about the township economy and the ways in which apartheid and apartheid laws restricted the growth of Black businesses. So it goes to your final comments and your introductory remarks. And very quickly, Julie Powell points out that on mendicants and pharmaceuticals, traditional remedies, of course, represented an extremely large market for a very long time, and in some ways blunted the expansion of quote-unquote civilized medicine, which is an important point, I'm sure we'll all agree. On that note, Mark Hunter.
Thanks, Stephen, and hi everyone. Hi, Debbie. I really enjoyed the paper, so thanks so much. And I'm kind of convinced about the kind of concept of a consumer revolution as you've broken it down in terms of demand, trading, stuff, and a new geography. My question really is kind of pushing you again back into the meanings of consumption. And when I was thinking about the miners that you were talking about and Patrick Harris talks about and all the commodities that were bought, I was also wondering whether you could also argue that there was something of a savings revolution that was taking place at the same time. And therefore, you know, we kind of have to think of these consumption and savings as related and not opposite, as they often are in popular culture. So for instance, you know, men who would have got Lobola cattle from their fathers are suddenly going to the mines, earning a wage, putting that wage into cattle over a very long period, but also other commodities that were tied up with weddings. So I'm wondering if that might be a way to kind of get beyond this Foucauldian, you know, manufacturing of desire by looking at these concrete choices and practices that, say, for instance, miners were making, because some of the money was going into commodities, some of it was going into cattle that was being sent back. I mean, there was all sorts of circuits that, if you can, you know, get a sense of that, tells a story about the kind of choices that I think is more sort of fruitful in terms than that, you know, the kind of desire paradigm. So yeah, I understand that, you know, you kind of, there's all sorts of different areas you could go into, but that was my sort of one take on it.
Can I answer that, Stephen?
Yes, if you can do so briefly, then we'll have Natasha and Mareka finally.
Mark, thanks. That's a great point, and it, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and it touches on a sort of broader conceptual, I suppose, theoretical issue about how I'm understanding the sort of affective registers of consumption, and absolutely going beyond desire as though that's the only thing, because it seems to me consumption is also about a sense of responsibility, a sense of care, the capacity to plan ahead, the capacity to be disciplined and restrained. You know, I'm specifically wanting to avoid the idea that consuming is just all about unrestrained, sort of an unmitigated and triumphalist kind of desire. So I'm absolutely with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Natasha?
Thanks, everyone. I had a question about chronologies, Debbie. I've been looking at recently, for a variety of reasons, at some of the stuff about slave reparations, particularly, where cash was going after 1834. And I know that Gerald Groenewald probably would have more to say on this. And notwithstanding Johan Ferre's work about this, because he doesn't really think about it seriously, I think, it seems to me that, and if you look at other work on sort of agrarian capital in the early Cape history, that an argument, I'm posing this as part of a broader question, an argument could be made for thinking about a kind of consumer revolution in the 1830s, sorry, in the Cape. But that's the Cape. And I think the point about the consumer revolution in the Cape is that's when the Cape is part of imperial circuits of commoditization and consumption. And so it's not necessarily about South Africa. And I mean, I do think that there's stuff going on there. So how does a kind of fairly, you know, if you're talking about the mineral revolution, we're talking about, you know, 4 separate entities that later become South Africa. And I'm wondering how your narrative, if you've had any thoughts about how your narrative might shift if you went further back in time, or to catch other significant moments. So, I mean, as you know, I think your assessment is great, but I'm just wondering how shifting that sort of, you know, starting at a different point in the long 19th century might shift the narrative. Thanks, everyone. These have been great questions, all of them, and thanks for the responses.
Before you reply, Debbie, let's take Mareka with a final question.
Okay, so Natasha, thanks. I mean, yeah.
Sorry, Debbie. Can Mareka just ask her question? Yeah. Okay. Then you can do a concluding, yeah.
Okay, sure.
I'll try to be brief because it was more of a comment than a question, and my own sort of, I suppose, why I really enjoyed the paper and found it very interesting. It's that in the work that I've been doing in the Children's Protection Archives, the South African Children's Protection Archives, particularly of the 1930s, one thing that fascinates me is that the availability of a discourse about poverty and race and what material possessions signify. And so what happens in the 1930s is let's call them volunteer social workers, sort of people, you know, the busybodies of the town who get involved in all kinds of small places in South Africa, say De Aar or wherever. Someone will try and manipulate the discourse of race and poverty in order to argue that a specific person qualifies as non-European, as in what in a more modern terminology one would say colored rather than native. And this is on the basis of possessions. And so there's a whole pivot around the civilized labor policy and ideas of detribalization and how you read that in terms of material possessions. And why I find this useful to think, your paper useful as a foil to think against, is there seems to be a kind of a fluidity of the discourse in the 1930s. And I wasn't sure how far back in time those notions of poverty and racialized poverty, how far back one can trace it. Yeah. Thanks.
Debbie, over to you for the concluding.
Okay, well, let me just quickly respond to Mareka first. And it sort of harks back also to the point that Tim made about the poor white question. Yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely, I think what might be available in this paper is the kind of early origins of a way of thinking about being white that is linked to material possession. And in the paper, I'm talking about it most strikingly in relation to affluence, and the idea of the beginnings of the idea of whiteness as a sense of material entitlement. Because certainly I think the nouveau riche, which was entirely white, both, you know, literally was only white people, but also its sense of itself was racialized, I think, from the start. And it was a way of thinking about what it meant to be white in terms of, you know, being materially sophisticated, being progressive, being worldly, in a world in which worldliness was increasingly given a material definition. So I'm glad if that is useful to you, because I do think that it pulls back those questions about the relationship between poverty and race back into an earlier, a few decades before. And Natasha, you know, I imagine that, so the question about when is a change sufficient to call it a consumer revolution? Was there a consumer revolution in the 1830s in the cave? I mean, it's partly, I suppose, it's a matter of interpretation, of course. But for me, from what I know, and I don't know enormous amounts about that period, I have probably what I've read is largely informed by what Johan Fourie has written about wealth, him and others, Robert Ross and Julie and others. I wouldn't know enough about the time to say, you know, was it sufficiently far-reaching and substantial to be considered revolutionary? But I do think that to find, as I'm trying to do, a consumer revolution in the late 19th century does not in any way preclude other epochs of significant change. For me, what is significant about a consumer revolution is partly the kind of, it's the combination of breadth and depth, and a kind of a sense of something that happens sort of across the board. And I don't know whether one could say that apropos the 1830s in the Cape. I mean, you probably know that better than I would, actually.
Thank you, Debbie. As we finally conclude, I should just add that Mareka pointed out that, of course, the category of audenticate or respectability is key here. And Louis Groenling points out that he's been doing research on the Johannesburg Zoo, and in the early 20th century, he found a very high level of traffic in animals, of course, to the Joburg Zoo, which is, and in some ways is part of the worlds of leisure and consumption that we've been talking about. But I just want to thank you, Debbie, and everyone for this fabulous seminar. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for doing this, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody else as well. Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.